This podcast is part of the Facebook group Just More Than Survivors of Suicide, Kansas City. Greetings and blessings whenever and wherever my brothers and sisters in Christ and fellow survivors of suicide, loss, and attempt. I am Brandy Johnson, ordained minister and fellow survivor of loss. As always, I want to begin with thanking everybody who is listening and tuning in. We are doing new things, and it takes a lot of courage. But it means a lot to have your support, whether or not you're directly affected by suicide. Knowing that these efforts are supported by a caring community makes a huge difference in continuing the fight to break the stigma and to openly talk about suicide. So recently I was able to visit with two lost survivors. And in the last podcast, I had some technical difficulties. I didn't catch the audio of my guest. But today, I do have the second guest and a successful recording. It gets a little scratchy in the beginning, but hang in there because we got it all cleared up. And now I'm thankful to be able to share it with all of you. My guest, Lacy, remembered her brother in our discussion and also gave some very helpful, heartfelt, and comforting guidance and advice at the end of our discussion. So make sure that you listen all the way through. That way you can hear what Lacy has to tell us. But I think it is important not only that we share the stories of our loved ones and of our own survival, but to also support and encourage each other through the wisdom that we've gained living through our own tragic experiences. And as we continue to live each and every day, it is important to remember that we are just more than survivors of suicide. We're advocates for people to stay because we can't afford to lose another single person. We are a community of people united, even though it is through the saddest point in our lives. But we are intended to come together to strengthen one another, to comfort one another, and to encourage one another. And I think it means a lot coming from a fellow survivor who can say that they understand. They understand what we might be feeling, what we might be thinking, although it is from their own perspective. It is comforting to know that we are able to openly talk about our loved ones, to discuss our mental health situations, and to be able to share our experiences so that someone else can see and hear that testimony and decide to stay because they hear how much they matter. They hear that they are not alone. And we must continue to encourage and support one another. But without delay, I want to go ahead and bring on our recording and discussion between myself and Lacy. So for the podcast purposes, I know you're a Kansas City resident and or Kansas City native.
Yes to both.
Yes. And your brother also died by suicide. Correct?
Yes, he did.
Okay. What was his name?
His name was Josh.
Josh. And how old was Josh?
He was 26, just 1 month shy of his 27th birthday.
Oh, but he's forever 26 now.
You know what? I said that backwards. He was 25, just 1 month shy of his 26th birthday.
Oh, still so young. This is something that is really hitting the younger community, especially like that from age 10 to age 24. But I think the statistics for folks too between like 25 and 34, they're neck and neck with the younger group of 10 to 24.
They are. He first started having issues with mental health when he was about 11 years old. That was about the first time that he had his first inpatient hospitalization.
And are you
He had,
older or younger than your brother? I'm sorry, were you
yeah, I'm young. I'm older than him.
older than him? So you're watching your
Yeah.
baby brother go through this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. There's 4 years between us.
Still not that big of an age gap, but enough when you're between the ages of 11 and 18, enough that there's kind of a social gap at that age. It probably makes it
Yes.
harder to bridge
We
that.
yeah, we were close enough to be friends with each other when our friends weren't around, but far enough apart in age that we didn't want the little kids hanging out with us when the big kids came over, you know?
Yes, yes. And when your brother started having mental health issues, I know for me it's something that wasn't talked about or acknowledged or educated on. Did you feel like you guys had open conversations about things, or was there a little bit of stigma that surrounded everything going on?
You know, in that respect, I am lucky because my mother is a nurse. Well, she's a nurse practitioner. She was just a regular nurse at that time. And so she was open about what was going on. And she tried to get us all involved in some family counseling. Um, so I didn't really feel like there was a big stigma involved with that at that time. And I'm very grateful for that because I think it would have been harder to deal with if we hadn't been open about it.
And that was what I was going to ask about, was if you felt like that helped you to kind of cope with things better. I know, we want to prevent things, but in some cases, things are not preventable, especially depending on how that person's, mental health continues to develop. How long again has it been since your brother died by suicide?
It will be 10 years in February.
It seems like a milestone, but I'm sure it still has its battles.
You know, it does. Some days it feels like it was yesterday, and some days it feels like it was 10 years ago. You know, it's just kind of crazy. I really thought by now that pain would have kind of lessened, and it has. You know, it when it first happened, it was every single day. It was like I couldn't keep my head above water. Um, and now, thankfully, those days hit me kind of infrequently, but when they hit, they still hurt just as bad as they did that first day.
I know sometimes those moments when we slow down and things kind of catch back up to us, or certain things, a sight, a sound, even a smell, can
Yeah.
bring back those memories. And me personally, like what we're doing now, I've want to channel that pain into a different purpose to be able to help others. And I hope that, people who do get to listen and hear stories from other survivors of loss, um, that not only somebody out there will realize that, hey, if I do this or I leave this way, my family's still going to be left behind with the pain. But for many of us, postvention is an issue too, being able to learn how to cope, especially like the first year here is a lot of shock.
Mm-hmm.
But many people, they wonder too, how long does it last? Does it change? Some people try to tell us to get over it or get past it. And, that's hard to deal with. It's hard to know exactly what we're supposed to do when people are looking at us. Uh, but just for yourself and how you've been able to deal and cope with things, have you found things that make it easier?
Yes, for me, I talk about my brother all the time. Um, there there's some, my grandparents don't, uh, don't like to talk about him, and they like to kind of close it down. And we kind of had a fight one day because I'm like, you closing him down and not talking about him and pretending he never existed, that's not healthy for anybody. He existed and he died. We all die. The way he died is not the way that most people die. But it doesn't change the fact that that's what happened. But remembering him and talking about him like he existed, because he did. And he was so much more than the way he died. I don't want to think about the way he died. I want to think about the way he lived and who he was. And so I talk about my brother every chance I get because I loved that kid. And that to me has been helpful. I know that grief that I have, and talking about it can make people uncomfortable, but I guarantee their discomfort with my grief is not anything compared to the discomfort that I'm feeling by having lost him.
I can definitely agree with you on that one. And I also agree, talking about our loved one, acknowledging their existence really can help us cope, because when everybody wants to shut down, like pushing that person out of memory, or not acknowledging that they were part of our family, they were a part of us, that we had love that existed. I think that is so much more painful for those of us that are surviving, that need to be able to talk about the love that we shared between them, the love that we still have for them. Makes a big difference to us who are hurting, where others, they want to shut out that pain, and I can understand that to a point. But I also think it's unhealthy for the people that do shut things out, because then they're not coming to terms with reality, and they're not dealing with the fact that someone that we love is now no longer with us. And I
Right.
just, too, I love to be able to talk openly about the good things, the good memories that we had, the little things that remind us of our loved one, uh, to kind of help us to feel like they are still with us in spirit, even though they
Mm-hmm.
can't be with us physically. I'm a big person of faith, so that is something that helps me through. But just in reality itself, when we're not able to talk about it with our loved ones, I think that hurts us more. So I am hoping it'll make a big impact for people who do hear this later, to know that they're not alone. There are others of us out there who we do want to talk about things, and we do want to be open so that someone else can hear that story and be able maybe to overcome their own situation, or just to know again that they're not alone out there, because a lot of time grief can isolate us and make
It
us
can.
feel like we're the only ones that remember them, or we're the only ones that want to speak their name. So I really
Right.
appreciate you being willing to be open, and I really like hearing that it helps you to be able to talk to, because I think more of us need an opportunity to not just be their voice, but to be our own voice,
Right.
especially when people are shutting doors and, kind of putting things back in the closet, where they tend to get a little dusty and decrepit, and they're harder to take back out later.
Right. Well, I've found that regardless of the way somebody dies, that death in general just makes people uncomfortable, and they are afraid to talk about the person who's died because they are afraid of making the person, uh, that are left behind, they're afraid of making those people upset or sad, or reminding them of what they lost. And my thought on that is, we don't forget. We haven't forgotten them. We think about them every day. So you're not doing us harm by bringing them up. You're doing us a favor. You're keeping their memory alive. In the Hispanic culture, there is a thing where they kind of call it like the two deaths. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Coco, but that's a pretty good explanation of it, where you go into the afterlife, and as long as people remember you and talk about you and still think of your memory, you still live on. You truly finally die when nobody speaks of you and nobody remembers you anymore. And I've always thought that was really beautiful. And so by speaking about the people that we love that have passed away, we're keeping them alive.
That's how
And
they're
there's nothing
able.
wrong with that.
That's how we are able to keep them there with us in spirit, and in memory. I think it helps
Yes.
too to talk, because it keeps our memories closer to the surface and more vivid. After a while, we add new memories into our minds from a psychological standpoint, and we don't lose our old memories, but I think it does get harder to access some of them from our memory banks, just because over time, not actively using that portion of our memory, we build new memories on top of that, which is a good thing. We should be building happy memories, but I think that talking and keeping the memory and the spirit alive of our loved one also helps us to continue remembering the good things and the love that we had between us. I'll have to check that movie out because I haven't seen it yet.
It's cute. It's a Disney movie, so it's on Disney Plus. It's cute. It's
I know.
of course it's a movie, but it does do a pretty good job of explaining that particular belief
Yeah, I
in
get what you're
Hispanic
saying. I think
cultures.
a lot of us can relate to that. I've seen a few movies since my own daughter has passed, and some of those movies I had seen before, some of them I had not, and they dealt with either grief or loss in one way or another. And I noticed things that actually comforted me and helped me to cope in different ways, just through seeing some of those movies. A couple of them did deal with suicide, and they were movies that I had seen before, and I didn't really click in my head until I rewatched them, and I seen the love and the compassion and a little bit of the story plot to healing helped me cope through things too. And I know my cousin Amber, and I'm sure
Yes,
she's probably seen that movie, so she and I will have a discussion about that afterwards too.
perfect.
But yeah, so I really appreciate and thank you today for being
No
willing to
problem.
do this and to help me out. I'm hoping that it'll help others who do hear that, again, they're not alone, they're not the only ones, and that maybe it can prevent someone out there because they were able to hear, hey, there is loss and there is pain. But there's an even greater pain that's left behind for survivors. And hopefully, those who might have decided to make an attempt would kind of think twice about that. For those of us that have survived loss, it makes us feel better to know, again, that we are in that crowd that is not alone, but also that we are out there willing to talk about things, to share stories, so that we can keep that memory alive. And we can also kind of find a community among ourselves. Uh, it bonds us in a strange way, but it also gives us hope to know that there are others out there who care about the loss that we've had, and they
Yeah.
share that same experience. But pardon me, I don't want to keep you too long since you're probably at work.
No, you're fine. There is just one final thing that I would really like to say to the survivors is to forgive yourself. Um, this was not your fault. We could have never, as much as we want to prevent suicide, and I think we should definitely be aware of people that are struggling and reach out and check on these people. This was not your fault. There was nothing you could have done to change their mind in that moment. So don't blame yourself. That is something I have struggled with for a very long time, and it has really just been within this last year that I have been able to kind of let go of that blame that I placed on myself.
That is an excellent point, because I'm sure
It
many of
doesn't
us,
serve you.
yes, I'm sure many of us, we go over what we could have done differently. Maybe not at that moment or on that day, but we think back to times when we could have never even known. And we put that guilt and blame on ourselves, thinking, well, I should have done this differently, or I should have said that differently. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that is wonderful that you're sharing that. I know personally that you have a deeper insight than what most of our listeners may know or understand. So those are very strong and powerful words coming from someone who is a survivor.
I know that it was hard to find peace after he died, and it still can be hard sometimes. And so if I can say something that maybe brings somebody else a little bit of comfort, that I want that, I want that for them.
That is awesome. I'm sorry I had to stop myself too because I get emotional still. I think we
Yeah.
always will.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I
being
think
able to
so.
hear it from the mouth of someone who has now lived and experienced this, and knowing that no amount of time is really going to change much except for the way that we learn how to cope and deal with things, and then we're able to come together again and build that community. So thank you again, Lacy, for today. And
You are welcome.
maybe we could talk some more in the future. I've got a lot more
Absolutely.
podcast ideas, and I may seek out more of your advice. I want to thank Lacy again for visiting with me and discussing with me and sharing about her brother Josh, who died by suicide 10 years ago in February and is forever 25. The love we have is blind to time, and the grief that we share isn't something that goes away overnight. It's permanent. So we have to learn how to cope with it and what we do with the love that we still have that has no physical place to land. As Lacy said, and for many of us who are survivors, talking about our loved one, acknowledging their existence, recalling the memories that we have, these things are helpful in coping. So it is comforting to hear this from another survivor, and also to hear that we need to forgive ourselves from the guilt that we live with that accompanies the grief. They say that misery loves company, but if we don't let go of that guilt, we are going to complicate our own grief. So maybe a big step in coping begins with forgiving ourselves. I know as a minister, I am forgiven by God. And so if God forgives us of that guilt that we lay on ourselves, then why should we not also forgive ourselves? I understand this guilt because we may feel responsible, like we were the only ones that could have helped, or that there was something more that we missed or didn't do. But I tell you that God is in control, and nothing happens unless He ordains it. And that's a different discussion, probably a separate sermon. But what I can tell you to comfort you is that we don't have the power to give or take life, but God does. And if He has decided to call someone home to Him, it doesn't matter how it happened. It matters that it was His decision and not our own. We can release ourselves from the burden of the guilt that we feel because it was not ours to begin with. That rests on God's shoulders. He makes the decisions. And there is someone greater than us. He is someone greater than us. He takes responsibility for these decisions, and He lifts that weight off our shoulders because it's too great of a weight for us to bear. And it's comforting to know. in the end that we have a God that makes these decisions. And there's nothing we can do to change them. But I couldn't agree more with Lacy that we need to begin with forgiving ourselves so that we can learn how to cope through our grief and maybe even one day be able to share our story and the story of our loved one. And maybe it will help encourage someone else walking the journey. And maybe, just maybe, they'll decide to stay. And lastly, I want to leave you with some advice that I received from a friend who has been helping me cope through grief. Number one, and as I've kind of already said, grief is love with no physical landing place anymore. Number two, the first year is the hardest. This is the year we are adjusting to our lives, to living without them in the flesh and with them in the spirit around us. Instead of being able to meet for lunch or spend the holidays with them, we merely get to feel their presence if we are so blessed. 3, there is no wrong way to grieve except to not grieve at all. 4, pace yourself emotionally. Don't try to rush yourself into quote unquote getting over it. 5, reach out like you have done here and with those closest to you. Communicate your needs to those who support you. You do matter. Now, I could talk for hours on each of these points of advice, but I want to leave that with you today in the hopes that whatever the message is you find in it, that it is what you needed to hear today. Thank you guys, as always, for listening and sharing and supporting this podcast. By doing so, I pray that you have also made a difference. I know that it makes a difference to me, and I hope that it will for someone else as well. And I hope to make a difference, again, in breaking the stigma that surrounds suicide by openly speaking and talking about it. If you have a story out there that you would like to share, please let me know. Please reach out, and we can schedule a time to talk. If you are in crisis, I also urge you to reach out. And if you don't have anybody else, or even if you do, you can still reach out to me. I have time to listen, and I have time to talk. Otherwise, there is also the 988 crisis hotline, the text to talk at 741-741, and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK 8255. Be sure to reach out to someone today. And as always, guys, until next time, God bless.